Clara Whitmore crawled through the Arizona dust, her dress torn and bloodied, her lips cracked from thirst. Behind her, somewhere in the shimmering heat, men were still hunting. She had run until her legs gave out, until the world became nothing but sky and sand and the certainty of death. When she finally collapsed beside a dry stone well, she didn't pray. She was done with prayers. She closed her eyes and waited for the end. Instead, she heard boots crunching toward her through the scrub, and a rough voice saying, "You picked a hell of a place to die." If you want to see how Clara survives what comes next, stay with me until the end. And if this story reaches you, hit that like button and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far her fight has traveled. The man standing over Clara was tall, lean, and weathered in a way that made it impossible to guess his age. His face was browned by the sun, marked with old scars, and framed by dark hair that hung unevenly past his collar. He didn't offer his hand. He just stood there, silhouette sharp against the white sky, studying her like she was a problem he hadn't asked for. "You hurt?" he said. Clara tried to speak, but her throat wouldn't cooperate. She shook her head. "Can you stand?" She wasn't sure. She tried anyway, bracing herself against the stones of the well. Her legs wobbled and she nearly went down again, but the man caught her elbow, firm, impersonal, like steadying a fence post. "My name's Cale Redstone," he said. "You're on my land, or what's left of it." Clara looked around. There was nothing but scrub and heat and wind. No house, no barn, just a pile of rough-cut timber stacked near a half-finished structure that might one day be a cabin if someone cared enough to finish it. "I'm Clara," she managed, her voice a rasp. Cale nodded once. "All right, Clara, let's get you out of the sun before you cook." He led her to the shelter of the cabin frame. 4 walls, a roof of canvas stretched over beams, dirt for a floor. Inside, it was 10 degrees cooler, and that alone felt like mercy. He handed her a canteen, and she drank until he pulled it away. "Slow," he said, "or you'll be sick." She nodded, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. Her fingers were shaking. Cale crouched beside a small iron stove in the corner and started a fire with practiced efficiency. He didn't ask her questions, didn't press. He just moved through the space like a man used to being alone, his silence so complete it felt like a kind of language. Clara studied him while he worked. There was something guarded in the way he held himself, like a dog that had been kicked too many times. His clothes were worn but clean. His hands were scarred, and when he finally looked at her again, his eyes were pale gray, cool and distant as winter sky. "You running from someone?" he asked. Clara hesitated, then nodded. "Figured," Cale said. He poured water into a dented pot and set it over the flame. "You don't end up out here by accident." "I didn't know where else to go." "There's nowhere else," Cale said flatly. "That's why I'm here too." He didn't elaborate, and Clara didn't push. She was too tired, too hollowed out. She leaned back against the timber wall and closed her eyes, listening to the crackle of the fire, the low whistle of wind through the beams. When she opened them again, Cale was holding out a tin cup of something hot. It smelled like sage and salt. "Broth," he said. "Drink it." She did. It wasn't much, but it was warm, and it quieted the worst of the hunger gnawing at her belly. "You can stay the night," Cale said, settling onto a crate across from her. "But come morning, you need to tell me what you're running from, and whether it's going to follow you here." Clara met his eyes. "It will." Cale didn't flinch. "Then we'll deal with it when it does." She woke before dawn to the sound of hammering. Cale was outside, shirtless in the gray light, driving nails into a beam with steady, methodical strikes. Sweat gleamed on his back, and she could see the ridges of old scars running across his ribs, his shoulders. He didn't look up when she stepped outside. "There's coffee in the pot," he said. Clara poured herself a cup and sat on a stump near the fire pit. The desert was still cool, the air sharp and clean. For the first time in weeks, she didn't feel like something was breathing down her neck. Cale finished the beam and wiped his hands on his trousers. He walked over, poured his own coffee, and sat across from her. "All right," he said. "Talk." Clara took a breath. "His name is Thomas Crowley. He owns half of Prescott, or thinks he does. I worked in his house as a kitchen girl. He decided he wanted more than that." Cale's expression didn't change, but something tightened in his jaw. I said no, Claire continued, more than once. He didn't care. So I ran. And he came after you, with men, horses, dogs. Claire's voice was flat, drained of emotion. He told people I stole from him, that I'm a thief and a liar, so even if I made it to another town, no one would help me. Cale was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, Crowley's got reach. If he wants you back, he won't stop looking. I know. So what's your plan? Clara laughed bitterly. I don't have one. I was just trying not to die. Kyle stared into his coffee, thinking. Finally, he said, You know what this land is? Clara shook her head. It's a homestead claim, Kale said. My father staked it before he died. I've been trying to prove it up, build a house, work the land, make it legitimate. But the law says a man can't hold a claim unless he's got a family, a wife, something that looks like permanence. Clara frowned. You don't have a wife. No. Cale looked at her directly. But if I did, they couldn't take the land. And if you were married, Crowley couldn't claim you. Clara's heart thudded hard in her chest. I'm saying we could help each other, Cale said evenly. You get protection. I keep the land. It's a business arrangement, nothing more. Clara stared at him, trying to read his face. There was no warmth in it, no softness, just cold practicality. And if I say no? She asked. Then you leave at first light, and I wish you luck. Clara looked out at the desert, at the empty horizon stretching in every direction. There was nowhere to go, nowhere safe. And Cale Redstone, for all his hardness, had pulled her out of the dust and given her water when he could have left her to die. All right, she said quietly. I'll do it. Cale nodded. We'll ride into town tomorrow. Find a preacher or a judge. Get it done quick. And then what? Then we survive. The town was called Sulphur Flats, a sun-beaten sprawl of clapboard buildings and red dirt streets. Cale led Clara to a narrow office above a saloon where a man named Judge Harrow conducted business between whiskey pours. Harrow was old, bloated, and bored. He barely looked at Clara. You want to marry this girl? He asked Cale. I do. She of age? 22, Clara said. Harrow shrugged. Good enough? You got a ring? Cale pulled a thin band of hammered silver from his pocket. Clara wondered where he'd gotten it, but didn't ask. The ceremony took 3 minutes. Harrow mumbled the words, Kyle slid the ring onto Clara's finger, and that was it. She was married to a man she barely knew, in a town she'd never heard of, with a name that wasn't hers anymore. When they stepped back into the sunlight, Kyle said, You need anything from town? Clara shook her head. Then let's go home. Home. The word felt strange in her mouth. The first week was silence and work. Kyle woke before dawn every day, and Clara learned to wake with him. He taught her how to haul water from the spring, how to patch the canvas roof, how to dig post holes without blistering her hands bloody. She learned fast because there was no room for weakness out here. At night they ate in silence. Beans, cornbread, sometimes a rabbit Kyle had snared. Then he would sleep on the floor near the stove, and Clara would take the cot in the corner. They didn't touch, didn't talk unless it was necessary. But slowly, Clara began to notice things. The way Kyle always made sure there was enough food for her before he ate. The way he reinforced the doorframe without being asked, because he'd seen her flinch at the sound of wind rattling the latch. The way he didn't look at her like she was damaged or used or broken. He looked at her like she was just another problem to solve. And somehow, that was easier to bear than pity. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Clara said, Why did your father pick this land? Cale didn't answer right away. He poked at the coals with a stick, his face unreadable. He wanted something that couldn't be taken, Kyle said finally. Something no one else wanted, so they'd leave him alone. Did it work? Cale's mouth twisted. No. Clara waited, but he didn't say more. 2 weeks after the wedding, a rider appeared on the horizon. Cale saw him first. He set down the axe he'd been using and walked to the edge of the property, hand resting on the pistol at his belt. Clara followed, her pulse quickening. The rider was young, maybe 16, with a wide-brimmed hat and a nervous look. He reined in his horse 10 feet from Kyle. You Cale Redstone? The boy asked. I am. The boy pulled a folded paper from his saddlebag and held it out. This is for you. Cale took it, unfolded it, and read in silence. His expression didn't change, but Clara saw his knuckles go white around the edges of the paper. What is it? She asked. Kyle handed her the letter. It was short, typed, official. Notice of disputed claim. You have 30 days to vacate the property or provide proof of legitimate settlement. Failure to comply will result in forfeiture. Claire's stomach dropped. Who sent this? The land office, Kyle said. But someone paid them to send it. Crowley. Cale folded the letter and tucked it into his coat. Maybe. Or someone else who wants the land. The boy shifted in his saddle. I'm supposed to wait for a reply. Kyle looked at him. Tell them I'm not leaving. The boy nodded and rode off, kicking up dust. Clara turned to Kyle. What do we do? We finish the cabin, Kyle said. We make this place look like a home, and we prove we're not going anywhere. Clara looked at the half-built structure, at the empty desert stretching beyond it. It seemed impossible, but Kyle was already walking back to the axe, back to the work, and so Clara followed. They worked like the land was trying to kill them, because it was. The sun was brutal. The wind tore at the canvas roof. The water from the spring ran low, and they had to dig deeper, haul heavier buckets, ration every drop. Clara's hands blistered, then calloused. Her back ached. Her skin burned and peeled and burned again. But the cabin grew. Kyle built the walls higher, fitted the door, framed the windows. Clara mixed mortar, carried stones, held beams in place while Kyle nailed them down. They didn't talk much, but they moved in rhythm, anticipating each other's next step. One afternoon, as Clara handed Cale a hammer, he said, "You're tougher than I thought." Clara looked at him, surprised. It was the closest thing to a compliment he'd ever given her. "I didn't have a choice," she said. "You did," Kyle said. "You could have stayed soft." "You didn't." Clara didn't know what to say to that, so she just nodded. That night, Kyle cooked stew, real stew, with meat and potatoes he must have bought in town. He divided it evenly and handed Clara her bowl. "What's the occasion?" she asked. "No occasion," Kyle said. "Just figured you earned it." They ate in comfortable silence, the fire crackling between them. And for the first time since she'd collapsed in the desert, Clara felt something close to safe. A week later, Crowley's men came. Clara was alone when they arrived. Kyle had ridden into town for supplies, and she was hanging laundry on a line she'd strung between two posts. She heard the horses before she saw them, 3 riders, moving slow and deliberate across the flat. Her blood went cold. She recognized the man in front. His name was Gage, and he'd been one of Crowley's enforcers back in Prescott. Broad-shouldered, mean-eyed, with a scar running down his cheek. Gage reined in his horse and tipped his hat, mockery dripping from the gesture. "Well, well," he said. "Look what we found." Clara forced herself to stand still, to meet his eyes. "You're trespassing." Gage laughed. "Trespassing? That's rich coming from a little thief." "I didn't steal anything. Mr. Crowley says different." Gage leaned forward in his saddle. "He's been real worried about you, Clara. Sent us all the way out here to bring you home." "I'm not going anywhere." Gage's smile faded. "That wasn't a request." One of the other men dismounted, a wiry figure with a revolver strapped to his hip. He started toward Clara. She stepped back, her hand instinctively reaching for the knife Cale had given her, just a small blade meant for cutting rope, but her fingers closed around it. "Don't make this hard," Gage said. The wiry man grabbed Clara's arm. She twisted, slashed with the knife, and caught him across the forearm. He yelped and jerked back, blood seeping through his sleeve. "You little—" Gage's voice cut through. "Enough!" He dismounted, slow and deliberate, and walked toward Clara. She backed up until she hit the cabin wall. "You think you can hide out here?" Gage said softly. "You think some nobody with a piece of dirt is going to protect you?" "He's my husband," Clara said, her voice shaking but firm. Gage laughed. "Your husband. Right. Crowley's going to love that." He reached for her, and Clara swung the knife again, but this time Gage caught her wrist, twisted hard, and the blade fell into the dirt. Clara cried out, struggling, but Gage was too strong. He dragged her toward the horses, and then a voice, cold and sharp as a rifle shot, cut through the air. "Let her go!" Gage froze. Cale stood 20 feet away, his horse behind him, a shotgun leveled at Gage's chest. "This doesn't concern you, Redstone," Gage said. "She's my wife," Kyle said. "That makes it my concern." Gage's grip on Clara tightened. Crowley wants her back. Crowley can go to hell. For a long moment, no one moved. The air was thick, electric, ready to snap. Then Cale cocked the shotgun. The sound was deafening in the silence. Gage let go of Clara and stepped back, hands raised. All right, we're leaving." "Good," Kyle said. "And don't come back." Gage mounted his horse, his face dark with fury. "This isn't over." "Yeah," Cale said. "It is." The three men rode off, kicking dust into the wind. Cale didn't lower the shotgun until they were out of sight. Then he turned to Clara. "You hurt?" She shook her head, but her hands were trembling. Cale set the shotgun down and picked up the knife from the dirt. He handed it back to her. "Keep it on you," he said. "Always." Clara took the knife, her throat tight. "Thank you." Cale just nodded. "Come on, let's get inside." That night, they didn't sleep. Cale sat by the window with the shotgun across his lap, and Clara sat by the stove, the knife on the crate beside her. Neither of them spoke, but the silence felt different now, charged, shared, like they were both holding their breath. Finally, Clara said, "He won't stop." "I know. He'll come back. With more men." "Probably." Clara looked at Kyle, at the hard lines of his face in the firelight. "Why are you doing this?" Cale was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Because I'm tired of running, and I'm tired of letting bastards like Crowley take what's mine." "I'm not yours," Clara said softly. Kyle met her eyes. "No, but this land is, and you're standing on it. That's enough." Clara didn't know what to say to that, so she just nodded. And somewhere in the dark hours before dawn, she realized she wasn't afraid anymore. Not of Crowley. Not of the desert. Not even of the man sitting across from her with a shotgun and a lifetime of scars. She was angry. And anger, she thought, was something she could use. The sun came up hard and fast, turning the desert into an oven. Clara woke with her head against the rough timber wall, the knife still gripped in her hand. Kyle was already outside, hammering something with the same relentless rhythm he'd kept since before dawn. She stood, her body stiff and aching, and stepped into the light. He dragged a stack of lumber to the front of the cabin and was building something that looked like a fence or a barricade. "What are you doing?" Claire asked. "Making it harder for them to ride straight up to the door," Cale said without stopping. "If they come back, I want to see them coming." Clara watched him work for a moment, then picked up a hammer from the pile. "Show me what to do." Cale glanced at her, surprised, then nodded toward a row of posts he'd already sunk into the ground. "Start nailing those crossbeams, 2 nails per joint. Make them tight." They worked side by side for hours, the heat pressing down on them like a hand. Clara's arms burned, her shoulders screamed, but she kept going. Every nail she drove felt like a small act of defiance, a way of saying she wasn't going to run again. By midday, they'd built a crude fence that ran along the front of the property. It wouldn't stop a determined man, but it would slow him down. And out here, that was the difference between living and dying. Cale wiped the sweat from his face and surveyed their work. "It'll do." Clara set down the hammer and flexed her sore hands. "What happens if they don't come back? What if Crowley just waits us out?" "Then we keep building," Kyle said. "We finish the cabin. We plant crops. We make this place real." "And if the land office takes it away?" Kyle's jaw tightened. "They won't." Clara wanted to believe him, but the letter had been clear. 30 days. And half of those were already gone. "We need proof," she said. "Something more than just walls and a marriage certificate." Cale looked at her. "What are you thinking?" "Witnesses," Clara said. "People who've seen us living here, building here. People who can testify that this is a real home." Cale frowned. "I don't know many people." "Then we find some." He was quiet for a moment, considering. Then he nodded. "All right. We'll ride into town tomorrow. Talk to the shopkeepers, the preacher, anyone who'll listen. But it's going to cost money." "How much do we have?" Kyle pulled a small leather pouch from his coat and poured the contents into his palm. A handful of coins, maybe $10 in total. Clara's heart sank. "That's it?" "That's it." She looked at the cabin, at the fence, at the barren stretch of land around them. Then we'll have to make it enough. Us. Sulphur Flats was busier than Clara remembered. The main street was crowded with wagons and horses, and the air smelled like dust and manure and frying meat. Kyle led her to a general store with a faded sign that read Tully's Goods. Inside, the shelves were stocked with canned food, tools, fabric, and ammunition. A heavy-set man with a beard stood behind the counter, sorting through a ledger. "Red Stone," the man said, not looking up. "Didn't expect to see you again so soon. Need to talk, Tully," Cale said. Tully finally looked up, his eyes flicking to Clara. "This the wife?" "She is," Tully grunted. "Heard you got hitched. Didn't believe it." "Believe it," Cale said, "and I need a favor." Tully set down his pencil and crossed his arms. "What kind of favor?" "I need you to write a letter to the land office," Cale said, "testifying that we're building a homestead, that we're living on the land, working it, making it legitimate." Tully raised an eyebrow. "Why would I do that?" "Because I've been buying supplies from you for 2 years," Kyle said, "and because if I lose the land, you lose a customer." Tully considered this, stroking his beard. "What's in it for me?" Cale pulled out the pouch of coins and set it on the counter. $5. Tully laughed. $5? For a letter that could get me crossways with whoever's trying to take your land? Not a chance. Cale's expression darkened. "Then what do you want?" Tully looked at Clara again, appraising. "Your wife any good with a needle?" Clara blinked. "I can sew." "Good," Tully said. "My daughter's getting married next month. Needs a dress made. You do that, I'll write your letter." Clara glanced at Cale, then back at Tully. "How much fabric?" "I'll provide it," Tully said. "You just need to make it look decent." Clara nodded slowly. "All right, I'll do it." Tully grinned and stuck out his hand. Cale shook it, his grip firm. "Deal," Tully said. "I'll have the fabric ready by end of week. Letter will be done when the dress is." As they left the store, Clara said, "I haven't made a dress in years." "Can you do it?" Kyle asked. "I'll figure it out." Kyle almost smiled. Almost. Bitant. They visited 3 more shops that afternoon, a blacksmith, a feed supplier, and a boarding house. Each one wanted something in exchange for a letter. The blacksmith wanted Clara to mend his work shirts. The feed supplier wanted Kyle to help repair a broken wagon. The boarding house owner wanted both of them to scrub her floors for a day. By the time they left town, Clara's head was spinning. "We're going to be working for half the town," she said. "Better than losing the land," Kyle replied. That night, back at the cabin, Clara spread out the fabric Tully had given her. Soft, cream-colored cotton, far nicer than anything she'd worn in years. She measured it twice, then started cutting, her hands steady despite the exhaustion pulling at her bones. Kyle sat nearby, sharpening his knife on a whetstone, the rhythmic scrape filling the silence. "Where'd you learn to sew?" he asked. "My mother," Clara said, "before she died." Kyle didn't press for details, and Clara was grateful. She didn't want to talk about her mother, about the fever that had taken her when Clara was 12, about the years that followed in kitchens and boarding houses, invisible and expendable. "What about you?" Clara asked. "Where'd you learn to build?" "My father," Kyle said. "He was a carpenter. Good one, too. Could make anything." "What happened to him?" Kyle's hand stilled on the whetstone. "He got sick. Lungs gave out. He lasted 6 months, and then he was gone." "I'm sorry." Kyle shrugged. "He left me the land. Figured that was enough." Clara looked at him, at the hard set of his shoulders, the way he kept his eyes down. She realized he was just as alone as she was. Maybe more. "It's a good piece of land," she said quietly. Cale looked up, met her eyes. "Yeah, it is." They held each other's gaze for a moment, something unspoken passing between them. Then Kyle went back to sharpening his knife, and Clara went back to sewing. Over the next 2 weeks, they worked harder than Clara thought possible. During the day, Kyle built. He framed the last wall of the cabin, fitted the door with proper hinges, cut window openings, and covered them with oiled canvas until he could afford glass. Clara helped where she could, but most of her time was spent on the jobs they'd bartered for, sewing, mending, scrubbing floors until her knees were raw. At night, she worked on Tully's daughter's dress, stitching by firelight until her fingers cramped. Cale never complained about the late hours, never told her to rest. He just kept working beside her, sanding beams, oiling hinges, doing whatever needed doing. Slowly, the cabin began to look like a home. Cale built a table from scrap wood, rough but sturdy. Clara sewed curtains from leftover fabric and hung them over the windows. Cale dug a root cellar and lined it with stones. Clara planted a small garden near the spring, tomatoes, beans, squash, and prayed the desert wouldn't kill them before they had a chance to grow. One evening, as they sat outside watching the sun set, Cale said, "You didn't have to stay, you know." Clara looked at him. "What do you mean?" "After Gage came," Cale said, "you could have left, found somewhere safer." "There's nowhere safer," Clara said. "Maybe, but you still chose to stay." Clara thought about that. She'd spent so much of her life running, hiding, trying to disappear. But here, with Cale, she didn't feel like she was disappearing. She felt like she was becoming something. "I'm tired of running," she said. Cale nodded. "Yeah, me too." They sat in silence, the desert stretching out before them, vast and unforgiving. But for the first time, Clara didn't feel small against it. She felt like she had a foothold, a place to stand. Eat. The dress was finished 3 days before the deadline. Clara held it up to the light, inspecting every seam, every stitch. It wasn't perfect. The hem was slightly uneven, and one of the sleeves sat a little higher than the other, but it was good. Better than good. It looked like something a bride would actually want to wear. Cale looked up from the beam he was planing. "That it?" "That's it." "Looks nice." Clara smiled, a rare thing. "Thanks." They rode into town the next morning, the dress carefully wrapped in cloth. Tully's shop was busy, but he made time to inspect Clara's work. He turned the dress over in his hands, checked the seams, held it up to the light. Finally, he grunted. "My daughter's gonna love this." Clara let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. Tully disappeared into the back room and returned with a folded letter, sealed with wax. He handed it to Cale. "There's your testimony," Tully said. "Sent a copy to the land office this morning." Cale took the letter, his expression carefully neutral. "Appreciate it." "Don't thank me yet," Tully said. "I heard Crowley's been asking around about you, offering money to anyone who'll testify against your claim." Clara's stomach tightened. "Who's taking it?" "No one so far," Tully said. "But money talks. And Crowley's got plenty of it." Cale folded the letter and tucked it into his coat. "We'll handle it." Tully looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "Good luck, Redstone. You're going to need it, chap." The other letters came in over the next week. The blacksmith delivered his in person, gruff but sincere. The boarding house owner sent hers by messenger. The feed supplier brought his along with a sack of grain he said was on the house. By the time the 30-day deadline arrived, they had 6 letters of testimony, a nearly finished cabin, and a garden that was just starting to sprout. Cale rode into the land office alone, the letters tucked inside his coat. Clara stayed behind, too nervous to sit still. She paced the length of the cabin, checked the garden, paced again. When Cale finally returned hours later, his face was unreadable. "Well?" Clara asked. Cale dismounted and handed her a piece of paper. It was stamped with the land office seal. Claim under review. Decision pending further inspection. Clara's heart sank. "That's it? After everything?" "They're sending an inspector," Cale said. 2 weeks from now. If the cabin's finished and we can prove we're living here as a family, they'll approve the claim." "And if we can't?" Cale's jaw tightened. "Then Crowley wins." Clara looked at the cabin, at the walls that still needed chinking, the roof that still leaked when it rained, the floor that was still packed dirt. 2 weeks. "We can do it," she said. Cale met her eyes. "Yeah, we can." Teed. They worked like the deadline was a noose tightening around their necks. Cale mixed mortar and chinked the gaps between the logs, sealing out the wind and dust. Clara scrubbed the walls, the table, the floor, until everything gleamed. Cale built a proper door frame and hung the door, heavy oak he'd traded for in town. Clara sewed a rug from scraps of fabric and laid it in front of the stove. Cale built shelves and stocked them with canned goods, tools, everything that said people lived here. Clara hung dried herbs from the rafters, filled jars with preserves, set the table with tin plates and cups. They worked until their hands bled, until they were too tired to speak, until the cabin looked less like a shelter and more like a place where two people might actually build a life. One night, as they collapsed by the fire, too exhausted to eat, Kael said, "You ever think about what happens after?" Clara looked at him. "After what?" "After we keep the land. After the inspector signs off and Crowley gives up. What do we do then?" Clara hadn't let herself think that far ahead. She'd been so focused on surviving the next day, the next week, that the idea of a future felt impossible. "I don't know," she said honestly. Kael nodded. "Me neither." They sat in silence, the fire crackling between them. And then, quietly, Kael said, "I'm glad you stayed." Clara looked at him surprised. It was the closest thing to sentiment he'd ever expressed. "I'm glad you let me," she said. Kael met her eyes, and for a moment something shifted between them. Not love, not yet, but something quieter. Trust, maybe. Or the beginning of it. Then Kael looked away, and the moment passed, but Clara carried it with her into sleep, a small warmth in the cold desert night. The inspector arrived on a Tuesday, a thin man in a dusty suit with a clipboard and a sour expression. His name was Brennan, and he looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Kael and Clara stood side by side as Brennan circled the cabin, making notes, peering into corners, checking the foundation. He asked questions. When had they married? How long had they lived here? What crops were they growing? And Kael answered each one with flat, factual precision. Brennan inspected the garden, the root cellar, the fence. He looked at the letters of testimony, read each one twice, and made more notes. Finally, he turned to Clara. "And you, Mrs. Redstone, you're satisfied with this arrangement?" Clara met his eyes. "I am." "You're not here under duress? You married of your own free will?" "I did." Brennan studied her for a long moment, as if trying to see through her. Then he nodded and made one last note on his clipboard. "All right," he said. "I'll file my report with the land office. You should have a decision within the week." Kael extended his hand. "Thank you." Brennan shook it, his grip limp. "Don't thank me yet." He climbed onto his horse and rode off, leaving Kael and Clara standing in the dust. "What do you think?" Clara asked. Kael watched Brennan disappear over the ridge. "I think we did everything we could." "And if it's not enough?" Kael looked at her, his expression hard. "Then we fight." The decision came 6 days later. Kael rode to town to collect the mail, and when he returned, he was holding a thick envelope with the land office seal. Clara's hands shook as she took it from him. She broke the seal and unfolded the letter inside. Claim approved. Land title granted to Kael Redstone and Clara Redstone. Congratulations on your homestead. Clara read it 3 times, not quite believing it. Then she looked up at Kael, and she saw something she'd never seen before. He was smiling. Not much, just a faint curve at the corner of his mouth. But it was there. "We did it," Clara said, her voice breaking. "Yeah," Kael said. "We did." Clara laughed, a sound halfway between relief and disbelief. And then, without thinking, she threw her arms around Kael's neck. He stiffened, surprised but didn't pull away. Slowly, carefully, he put his arms around her and held on. They stood like that for a long moment, 2 people who'd fought the desert, the law, and their own fear, and won. When Clara finally stepped back, her eyes were wet, but she was still smiling. "What now?" she asked. Kael looked at the cabin, at the land stretching out beyond it. "Now we make it a real home." That night, they celebrated with the last of the whiskey Kael had been saving. They sat by the fire, passing the bottle back and forth. And for the first time since they'd met, they talked. Kael told her about his father, about the years they'd spent building houses together, moving from town to town, never settling. He told her about the day his father staked the claim, how he'd said it was the last place they'd ever have to run to. Clara told him about her mother, about the fever, about the years of working in kitchens and dodging men like Crowley. She told him about the day she'd decided to run, how she'd walked out of Prescott with nothing but the clothes on her back and the certainty that she'd rather die in the desert than live on her knees. I thought I was going to die out here, Clara said. I really did. So did I, Kyle said. When my father passed, I didn't think I could do it alone. Clara looked at him. You're not alone anymore. Cale met her eyes, and something passed between them, something deeper than words. No, he said quietly. I'm not. The fire burned low, and the night grew cold, but neither of them moved. They just sat there, side by side, two people who'd been broken by the world and were learning slowly to be whole again. 2 days later, the riders came. Clara was in the garden, pulling weeds, when she heard the sound of hooves. She looked up and saw them, 6 men, spread out in a line, riding slow and deliberate toward the cabin. Her blood turned to ice. Kyle was inside, repairing the stove. Clara dropped the weeds and ran to the door. Kyle, she said, her voice tight. They're here. Kyle looked up, saw the riders through the window, and his expression went cold. He stood, grabbed the shotgun from beside the door, and stepped outside. Clara followed, her hand on the knife at her belt. The riders stopped 20 feet from the fence. Gage was there, and so were the other 2 from before. But the man in the center was new, older, well-dressed, with a sharp face and eyes like a snake. Thomas Crowley. He looked at Clara like she was a piece of property he'd misplaced. Mrs. Whitmore, Crowley said, his voice smooth. Or is it Mrs. Redstone now? It's Redstone, Clara said, her voice steady. How unfortunate, Crowley said. I've come all this way to bring you home, and you've gone and complicated things. She's not going anywhere, Cale said. Crowley's eyes flicked to Cale, dismissive. And you must be the husband. How quaint. Cale leveled the shotgun at Crowley's chest. Get off my land. Crowley smiled. Your land? Yes. I read the land office report. Quite impressive. You've built a charming little homestead here. Then you know it's legal, Kyle said. And you've got no claim. Legal, Crowley repeated, as if tasting the word. That's a flexible term, Mr. Redstone. Especially out here. He gestured to the men flanking him. I've brought witnesses who will testify that this marriage is a sham, that you coerced a vulnerable young woman into signing papers, that this entire homestead is built on fraud. Clara's stomach twisted. That's a lie, is it? Crowley said. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like a desperate man who needed a wife to keep his land and a runaway thief who needed a place to hide. She's not a thief, Kyle said. Crowley shrugged. The courts will decide that. Cale's finger tightened on the trigger. I said get off my land. Crowley's smile faded. You won't shoot me, Mr. Redstone. You're not that stupid. Try me. For a long moment, no one moved. The desert was silent except for the wind. Then Crowley laughed, a cold, calculated sound. Very well. Keep your land. Keep your wife. But I'll be back. And when I am, I'll bring the law with me. Let's see how long your little homestead lasts then. He turned his horse and rode off, his men following. Cale didn't lower the shotgun until they were out of sight. Then he turned to Clara, his face pale. He's not done. I know, Clara said. He's going to come back. With lawyers, with the sheriff, with whatever it takes to tear this place apart. Clara looked at the cabin, at the land they'd fought so hard to keep. Then she looked at Kyle. Then we'll be ready, she said. Cale met her eyes, and she saw something there, something fierce and unbreakable. Yeah, he said. We will. And as the sun set over the desert, turning the sky blood red, Clara realized something. She wasn't afraid anymore. She was ready to fight. That night, Kyle didn't sleep. He sat by the window with the shotgun across his knees, watching the darkness for movement that never came. Clara tried to rest on the cot, but every sound made her flinch. The wind rattling the shutters, a coyote howling somewhere in the distance, the creak of settling timber. By the time the sky began to lighten, neither of them had slept more than an hour. Kyle stood and set the shotgun against the wall. His face was drawn, shadows under his eyes. We need more weapons, he said. Clara sat up. What kind? Whatever we can get. Rifles, pistols, ammunition. If Crowley comes back with the law, we can't shoot our way out. But if he comes back with hired guns, we need to be able to defend ourselves. Clara nodded. How much will it cost? More than we have. They looked at each other across the dim cabin, the weight of that reality settling between them. Then we'll have to earn it, Clara said. Cale rubbed his face, exhausted. Doing what? Whatever it takes. Kael rode into Sulphur Flats that morning while Clara stayed behind to keep watch. She worked in the garden, pulling weeds and watering the fragile shoots, but her eyes kept drifting to the horizon. Every dust cloud made her heart race. Every distant sound made her reach for the knife. When Kael returned in the late afternoon, he had a rifle slung over his shoulder and a box of ammunition in his saddlebag. He also had a bruise darkening along his jaw. Clara met him at the fence. What happened? Ran into some of Crowley's men at the saloon, Kael said, dismounting. They had opinions about our marriage. And you gave them yours? Kael's mouth twitched. Something like that. He handed Clara the rifle. It was old, the wood scratched and the barrel worn, but it was clean and well maintained. You know how to shoot? Kael asked. My father taught me when I was young. It's been a while. Then we'll practice. They spent the rest of the afternoon setting up targets, old cans and bottles lined up on the fence posts. Kyle showed Clara how to load the rifle, how to sight down the barrel, how to account for wind and distance. She fired 6 shots and hit 3 cans. Not bad, Kyle said. Not good either. You'll get better. They practiced until the sun began to set and the ammunition ran low. Clara's shoulder ached from the recoil, and her ears rang from the gunfire, but she felt steadier, more capable, like she had a fighting chance. That night, over a simple dinner of beans and cornbread, Cale said, I talked to the blacksmith. He's heard rumors that Crowley's been meeting with the territorial judge, trying to get our marriage annulled. Clara's stomach dropped. Can he do that? If he convinces the judge we committed fraud, yeah, he can. But we have the letters. We have proof. Proof can be bought, Kyle said. Same as anything else. Clara set down her fork, her appetite gone. So what do we do? Kyle was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, we need someone who can speak for us. Someone Crowley can't buy. Who? The preacher who married us, Judge Harrow. Clara frowned. Harrow didn't even look at me during the ceremony. He's not going to help us. Maybe not, Kyle said. But he's the one who made it legal. If he testifies that the marriage was legitimate, it'll be harder for Crowley to break it. Clara considered this. And if Harrow refuses, then we find another way. Amont. They rode back to Sulphur Flats 2 days later, this time together. The town was quieter than before, the streets half empty under the midday sun. Kyle led Clara to the narrow staircase above the saloon where Judge Harrow kept his office. Harrow was there, bent over a stack of papers, a bottle of whiskey within easy reach. He looked up when they entered, his expression sour. Redstone, he said. Back again? Need to talk, Kyle said. Harrow leaned back in his chair, eyeing them both. About what? Our marriage. There's a man named Crowley trying to get it annulled. Says it's fraud. Harrow snorted. Is it? Cale's jaw tightened. No. Then why is he claiming otherwise? Because he wants my wife back, Cale said, and he'll say whatever it takes to get her. Harrow looked at Clara, his gaze slow and appraising. You want to be married to this man? Clara met his eyes. I do. Why? Because he's kept me alive, and because I choose to be here. Harrow grunted and poured himself a drink. You know what people are saying, don't you? They're saying you married her to keep your land, that she married you to hide from the law. People can say whatever they want, Kyle said. Doesn't make it true. Harrow drained his glass and set it down with a thud. What do you want from me? I want you to testify, Kyle said. If this goes to court, I need you to tell them the marriage was legal, that we both consented, that there was no coercion. Harrow laughed, a bitter sound. You think I'm going to stand up in front of a territorial judge and go against a man like Crowley? I think you're a man who took an oath, Kyle said, and I think you've got enough of a conscience left to honor it. Harrow's smile faded. He looked at Kyle for a long moment, then at Clara. Finally, he sighed. All right, he said. If it comes to court, I'll testify. But don't expect me to do it for free. How much? Kyle asked. $20. Kyle's face went hard. I don't have $20. Then I guess you're out of luck. Clara stepped forward. I'll work for it. I can sew, clean, cook, whatever you need. Harrow raised an eyebrow. I don't need a maid. Then what do you need? Harrow considered her, then gestured to the stacks of paper covering his desk. I need someone to organize this mess. Sort the files, copy the records, make it so I can find something when I need it. You do that. I'll testify. Clara looked at the chaotic piles, the coffee-stained ledgers, the loose papers scattered everywhere. It would take days, maybe weeks. I'll do it, she said. Harrow nodded. Start tomorrow. For the next 2 weeks, Clara rode into town every morning and worked in Harrow's office while Kyle stayed at the cabin, fortifying the fence and keeping watch. The work was tedious, sorting legal documents, copying names and dates into ledgers, filing papers in some semblance of order. Harrow mostly ignored her, drinking and muttering to himself while she worked, but Clara didn't mind. The work gave her time to think, to plan. And it kept her hands busy, which kept her mind from spiraling into fear. One afternoon, as she was filing a stack of land deeds, she came across a document that made her stop. It was a claim notice for Kyle's land, dated 3 months before he'd staked it. The name on the deed was illegible, but the filing date was clear. Clara's heart pounded. If someone had filed a claim before Kyle, then his homestead might not be legitimate. And if Crowley found this document, he could use it to destroy everything. She looked at Harrow, who was dozing in his chair, the whiskey bottle half empty beside him. Then she looked back at the document. Slowly, carefully, she folded it and tucked it into her skirt pocket. That evening, back at the cabin, Clara showed Kyle the document. He read it twice, his face going pale. This can't be right. It's dated and stamped, Clara said. Someone filed a claim on this land before you did. Kyle set the paper down, his hands shaking. My father said the land was unclaimed. He checked the records himself. Maybe he missed it. Or maybe someone filed it after he checked. Or maybe it's fake, Kyle said, his voice hard. Crowley could have had someone plant this. Make it look like my claim's invalid. Clara frowned. But it's in Harrow's files. How would Crowley get access? Money, Kyle said bitterly. Same way he gets everything else. They sat in silence, the weight of the discovery pressing down on them. What do we do? Clara asked. Kyle looked at the document, then at her. We find out if it's real, and if it is, we find out who filed it. The next day, Clara returned to Harrow's office and searched through the records again, this time looking for anything related to the name on the claim. It took hours, but she finally found a cross-reference, a filing made by a man named Samuel Dorn, a land speculator who'd operated in the territory 15 years earlier. She brought the information to Kyle that night. Dorn's been dead for 10 years, Kyle said after reading the notes, which means the claim's invalid. Unless someone's using his name, Clara said, to make it look legitimate. Kyle's jaw tightened. Crowley. It has to be. Then we need proof. Something that shows Dorn's claim was never valid or that it was abandoned. Clara nodded. I'll keep looking. Over the next few days, Clara worked through Harrow's files with renewed focus, searching for anything that could help. She found old tax records, abandoned claims, property disputes that had been settled decades ago. And then, buried in a stack of dusty ledgers, she found what she was looking for. A notation that Samuel Dorn's claim had been revoked due to non-payment of taxes. The revocation was dated 12 years earlier, 3 years before Kyle's father had staked the land. Clara's hands trembled as she copied the entry. This was it. Proof that the claim was invalid. Proof that Kyle's homestead was legitimate. She tucked the copy into her pocket and finished the day's work, her heart racing. That night she showed Kyle the notation. He read it, then read it again. Then he looked up at her, something close to hope in his eyes. This could save us, he said. If Harrow testifies, Clara said, and if the judge accepts it. He will, Kyle said. He has to. But 2 days later, everything changed. Clara was in Harrow's office filing the last of the documents when the door opened and Thomas Crowley walked in. She froze. Crowley looked at her, then at Harrow, who'd straightened in his chair. Mr. Crowley, Harrow said, his voice careful. Didn't expect to see you. I'm sure you didn't, Crowley said. He turned to Clara. Mrs. Redstone, how industrious of you. Clara didn't respond. She kept her hand steady, her face blank. Crowley walked to Harrow's desk and set down a leather satchel. I believe we have business to discuss. Harrow glanced at Clara. Maybe you should... She can stay, Crowley said. This concerns her. He opened the satchel and pulled out a stack of bills. $500, Judge, in exchange for a signed statement declaring that the marriage between Clara Whitmore and Cale Redstone was conducted under fraudulent pretenses. Harrow stared at the money, his face pale. Clara's stomach turned. You can't do that, she said. Crowley smiled. I just did. Harrow looked at Clara, then at the money. His hand shook. Don't, Clara said. Please. Harrow swallowed. I need to think about this. Think fast, Crowley said. The offer expires at sundown. He turned and walked out, leaving the money on the desk. Clara looked at Harrow, her heart pounding. You're not going to take it. Harrow didn't answer. He just stared at the bills, his face ashen. Harrow, Clara said. You promised. I promised to testify, Harrow said quietly. I didn't promise to go broke doing it. Clara felt something break inside her. So that's it? You're just going to sell us out? Harrow closed his eyes. I'm sorry. Clara grabbed the document she'd been filing and walked out, slamming the door behind her. She rode back to the cabin in a blur of rage and fear. When she arrived, Kyle was outside repairing the fence. He took one look at her face and set down his tools. What happened? Clara told him everything. Crowley's offer, Harrow's hesitation, the money sitting on the desk. Kyle's expression went cold. He's going to take it. I don't know, Clara said. Maybe, I don't know. Kyle walked to the cabin and grabbed the shotgun. Then we go back and make sure he doesn't. Kyle, I'm not letting Crowley buy this land out from under us, Kyle said. Not after everything we've done. Clara grabbed his arm. If you threaten Harrow, it'll make everything worse. He'll testify against us for sure. Cale stopped, his jaw clenched. Then what do we do? Clara thought fast. We give him a reason to say no. Something stronger than money. Like what? Clara pulled the notation from her pocket, the proof that Dorn's claim was invalid. We show him this. We prove that Crowley's trying to steal the land based on a lie. If Harrow knows the truth, maybe he'll do the right thing. Kyle looked at the paper, then at Clara. And if he doesn't? Clara met his eyes. Then we fight. They rode back to town that evening just as the sun was setting. Harrow's office was dark, but the door was unlocked. They found him inside, sitting at his desk, the money still untouched. He looked up when they entered, his face haggard. I figured you'd come back, he said. Cale set the notation on the desk. Read this. Harrow picked it up, squinting in the dim light. As he read, his expression changed, confusion, then understanding, then something like anger. This says Dorn's claim was revoked, Harrow said. It was, Clara said, which means any claim filed under his name is fraudulent. Harrow looked at her. And Crowley knows this? He has to, Cale said. He's using it to make my claim look illegitimate. But if you testify and present this notation, the whole thing falls apart. Harrow set the paper down and looked at the money. For a long moment, he didn't speak. Then he pushed the stack of bills across the desk toward Kyle. Give this back to Crowley, Harrow said, and tell him I don't work for liars. Clara felt a wave of relief so strong it nearly knocked her over. You'll testify? She asked. Harrow nodded. I'll testify. And I'll bring this notation with me. Cale picked up the money, his expression unreadable. Thank you. Harrow waved him off. Don't thank me yet. Crowley's not going to take this lying down. Let him try, Kyle said. Well, they left the money with Harrow. He would return it to Crowley in the morning, and rode back to the cabin under a sky full of stars. The desert was quiet, the air cool, and for the first time in weeks, Clara felt like they might actually survive this. But that feeling didn't last. They were halfway home when Kyle pulled his horse to a stop. You hear that? He said. Clara listened. At first there was nothing. Then she heard it, the faint sound of hoofbeats coming from the direction of the cabin. Kael's face went hard. Ride! Fast! They kicked their horses into a gallop, racing across the flat desert. Clara's heart pounded, her mind running through every terrible possibility. By the time they crested the ridge and saw the cabin, the worst of those possibilities had come true. The cabin was on fire. Flames licked up the walls, orange and furious against the black sky. Smoke poured from the windows, thick and choking. And in the firelight, Clara could see men on horses, circling the property, torches in their hands. Crowley's men. Kael didn't hesitate. He spurred his horse forward, the shotgun already in his hands. Clara followed, the rifle clutched tight against her chest. This was it. The fight they'd been preparing for, the moment everything would be decided. And as the flames rose higher and the men turned to face them, Clara felt something harden inside her. She wasn't running anymore. She was done running. Bam! Kael fired first, the shotgun blast echoing across the desert. One of Crowley's men went down, his torch falling into the dirt. The others scattered, shouting, drawing their weapons. Clara dismounted and took cover behind the fence, her hands shaking as she loaded the rifle. She'd practiced this. She knew what to do, but knowing and doing were two different things when bullets started flying. A man on horseback charged toward the fence, pistol raised. Clara sighted down the barrel, took a breath, and fired. The man jerked backward and fell. Clara's stomach lurched, but she didn't have time to think. She reloaded and fired again, this time at a man running toward the cabin with another torch. The shot went wide, but it was close enough to make him dive for cover. Kael was moving through the chaos like a storm, firing, reloading, never stopping. He shot another man off his horse, then used the butt of the shotgun to knock down a third who got too close. But there were too many of them, and the cabin was burning. Clara saw a man slip around the side of the building, heading for the door. If he got inside, he could trap them, burn them out. She ran. Her legs pumped, her lungs burned, and she reached the cabin just as the man kicked in the door. He turned, saw her, and raised his pistol. Clara didn't think. She just swung the rifle like a club, catching him across the face. He staggered, and she hit him again harder. He went down, blood streaming from his nose. Clara stepped over him and into the cabin. The heat was overwhelming. Flames crawled up the walls, consuming the curtains, the shelves, everything they'd built. Smoke filled the air, thick and black, and Clara could barely see. But she could hear voices outside. Shouting, gunfire. And then, through the smoke, she saw him. Thomas Crowley. He was standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the firelight, a pistol in his hand. "Clara," he said, his voice calm. "It's over. Come with me now, and I'll let Redstone live." Clara tightened her grip on the rifle. "No!" Crowley's expression hardened. "You don't have a choice." "I always have a choice." Crowley raised his pistol, aiming at her chest. "Then you've made the wrong one." But before he could fire, a shot rang out from behind him. Crowley jerked, stumbled, and fell. Kael stood in the doorway, smoke rising from the barrel of his shotgun. Clara ran to him, and together they stumbled out of the burning cabin and into the night. By the time the fire burned itself out, 3 of Crowley's men were dead. 2 were wounded and fleeing, and Crowley himself lay in the dirt, bleeding from a wound in his side. Kael stood over him, the shotgun still raised. "You're done," Kael said. Crowley coughed, blood on his lips. "You think killing me will change anything? There's always someone else, always another man like me." "Maybe," Kael said. "But it won't be you." Crowley laughed, a wet, rattling sound. "You're a fool, Redstone. You've lost everything." Kael looked at the cabin, blackened, half collapsed, still smoldering. Then he looked at Clara, standing beside him, her face streaked with soot and blood, but her eyes fierce. "No," Kael said. "I haven't." He lowered the shotgun. Crowley's laughter faded. He tried to say something else, but the words died in his throat. His head fell back, and he went still. Clara looked at the body, then at Kael. "What now?" Kael wiped the soot from his face and looked at the ruined cabin. "Now we rebuild." The sun came up over a landscape of ash and ruin. Clara stood in front of what was left of the cabin, her arms wrapped around herself, staring at the blackened beams and collapsed roof. The walls still stood, barely, but everything inside was gone. The table Kyle had built, the curtains she'd sewn, the shelves, the stove, the rug, all of it reduced to charcoal and smoke. Kyle was dragging Crowley's body toward the edge of the property, where two of the dead men already lay. His movements were mechanical, his face blank. Clara watched him work, then turned back to the wreckage. She should have felt devastated. She should have been crying or screaming or collapsing under the weight of it all. But instead, she just felt empty. Hollow. Like the fire had burned something out of her too. When Kyle finished, he walked back to her, his hands black with soot and blood. "We need to bury them," he said. Clara nodded. They spent the morning digging graves in the hard desert earth. It was brutal work, the ground refusing to give, the sun beating down without mercy. Clara's hands blistered, then bled, but she kept digging. Cale worked beside her, silent and grim. By noon, they'd buried all three men in shallow graves marked with nothing but stones. Kyle stood over Crowley's grave for a long moment, his face unreadable. "Should have let him burn," he said finally. Clara didn't disagree. That afternoon, riders appeared on the horizon. Clara's hand went to the rifle, but Kyle put a hand on her arm. "It's the sheriff," he said. Clara squinted. He was right. The man in front wore a star pinned to his vest, and the two men with him had the tired look of deputies who'd rather be anywhere else. The sheriff reined in his horse and looked at the burned cabin, then at Kyle and Clara. "Heard there was trouble out here," the sheriff said. His name was Dunn, a weathered man in his 50s with a gray mustache and eyes that had seen too much. "There was," Kyle said. Dunn dismounted and walked toward the graves. "How many dead?" "3, all Crowley's men." Dunn looked at the fresh dirt, then at Kyle. "Where's Crowley?" Cale pointed to the third grave. Dunn's expression didn't change. "You kill him?" "He came here with armed men," Kyle said. "Set fire to my home, tried to kill my wife. I defended what's mine." Dunn looked at Clara. "That how it happened?" Clara met his eyes. "Yes." Dunn walked to the cabin and examined the charred remains. He kicked at a piece of burnt timber, then turned back to Kyle. "Crowley's got family in Prescott," Dunn said. "They're going to want answers." "Then give them the truth," Kyle said. "He attacked us. We fought back. He lost." Dunn studied him for a long moment. "You got witnesses?" "Judge Harrow knows what Crowley was doing," Clara said. "He can testify." Dunn grunted. "Harrow's a drunk." "He's also the man who married us," Cale said. "And he's got documents proving Crowley was trying to steal this land with fraudulent claims." Dunn looked skeptical. "That true?" "It is," Clara said. "We can show you the records." "Yes." Dunn chewed on that, then sighed. "All right. I'll talk to Harrow. But if this turns into a legal mess, you two are going to need a lawyer." "We don't have money for a lawyer," Kyle said. "Then you better hope Harrow's testimony is enough." Dunn mounted his horse and looked down at them. "I'll be back in a week. You two stay put." He rode off with his deputies, leaving Clara and Kyle alone in the ash. The first thing they did was salvage what they could from the wreckage. The stove was cracked, but usable. A few tools had survived in the root cellar. The water barrel was scorched, but intact. Everything else was gone. Kyle set up a makeshift camp near the spring, stringing canvas between two posts to create a shelter. It wasn't much, barely enough to keep the sun off, but it was something. Clara gathered what remained of their supplies and took stock. They had enough food for maybe a week if they rationed. Enough ammunition for one more fight if it came to that. That night they sat by a small fire, eating cold beans straight from the can. Neither of them spoke. The silence was thick, heavy with exhaustion and grief. Finally, Clara said, "I killed a man today." Kyle looked at her. "I know. I hit him with the rifle, knocked him down, and then I just left him there while the cabin burned." "He would have killed you if you hadn't," Kyle said. "I know." Clara stared into the fire. "But I can still see his face, the way he looked at me before I hit him." Kyle was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The first man I killed, I was 17. He tried to rob my father on the road. I shot him with a rifle my father had just taught me to use. I threw up afterward, couldn't eat for 2 days." Clara looked at him. Does it get easier? No, Kael said. It just becomes something you carry. They sat in silence again, the weight of what they'd done settling over them like dust. Do you regret it? Clara asked. Any of this? Kael looked at her, and for the first time since she'd met him, his expression softened. No, he said. I don't. Clara felt something shift in her chest, something warm and unexpected. Neither do I, she said. Over the next few days, they began to rebuild. Kael cut new timber from the scrub forest to the east, hauling it back in the wagon. Clara cleared the ash and debris from the cabin, sorting through the wreckage for anything salvageable. It was slow, exhausting work, and every board they set in place felt like a small victory against everything that had tried to destroy them. On the fourth day, Tully arrived with a wagon full of supplies: nails, canvas, flour, coffee, and a crate of canned goods. Kael frowned. I didn't order this. I know, Tully said. Consider it a loan. You can pay me back when you're on your feet. Kael looked at the supplies, then at Tully. Why? Tully shrugged. Because Crowley was a bastard, and I'm glad he's dead. And because you've got guts, Redstone. Both of you. Clara felt her throat tighten. Thank you. Tully nodded and climbed back onto his wagon. Don't thank me yet. You've still got to rebuild the damn thing. As he rode off, Clara turned to Kael. People are starting to notice. Yeah, Kael said. Let's hope that's a good thing. A week later, Sheriff Dunn returned, this time with Judge Harrow riding beside him. Harrow looked pale and hungover, but he carried a leather satchel stuffed with documents. Dunn dismounted and surveyed the progress they'd made. The cabin walls were halfway rebuilt, and a new roof frame was taking shape. You work fast, Dunn said. We don't have a choice, Kael replied. Harrow climbed down from his horse and opened the satchel. I've brought everything. The notation about Dorn's claim, the marriage certificate, letters from the townspeople, all of it. Dunn took the documents and flipped through them, his expression unreadable. Finally, he looked up. Crowley's family is pushing for charges, Dunn said. Murder, arson, theft of property. Clara's stomach dropped. We didn't steal anything. They're claiming Crowley owned this land, that you murdered him to take it. Kael's jaw clenched. That's a lie. I know, Dunn said, and Harrow's testimony should be enough to prove it. But there's going to be a hearing. Territorial judge is coming through in 2 weeks. You'll have to present your case. And if we lose? Clara asked. Dunn's face was grim. Then you hang. The weight of that reality crushed down on them like a landslide. For all they'd survived, for all they'd fought through, it could still end with a rope around their necks. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She lay on the bedroll under the canvas shelter, staring up at the stars, her mind racing. Kael was awake too, sitting by the fire, sharpening his knife with slow, deliberate strokes. What are you thinking? Clara asked. Kael didn't look up. I'm thinking we need more than testimony. We need someone who can argue the law, someone who can stand up to Crowley's lawyers and make them look like the liars they are. Where are we going to find someone like that? Kyle was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, There's a woman in Prescott, lawyer named Elodie Marsh. She's tough, smart, doesn't back down from anyone. Will she help us? I don't know, but she's the only chance we've got. They rode to Prescott 2 days later, leaving the half-finished cabin behind. The town was bigger than Sulphur Flats, more prosperous, with brick buildings and paved streets. Clara felt exposed here, like every eye was on her judging. Kael led her to a narrow office on the second floor of a bank building. The door had a brass plate that read, E. Marsh, Attorney at Law. Kael knocked. A voice from inside called, Come in. They entered to find a woman in her 40s sitting behind a desk, covered in legal briefs. She had sharp features, dark hair pinned back, and eyes that missed nothing. She looked up as they entered, her gaze flicking between them. Kael Redstone, she said. Didn't expect to see you again. Elodie, Kael said, and this must be the wife I've been hearing about. Elodie stood and extended her hand to Clara. Elodie Marsh. Clara shook it. Clara Redstone. Elodie gestured to the chairs in front of her desk. Sit. Tell me why you're here. Kael laid out the whole story. Crowley, the attack, the fire, the charges. Elodie listened without interrupting, her fingers steepled in front of her face. When Kael finished, Elodie leaned back in her chair. So Crowley's family is claiming you murdered him to steal land that was never his in the first place. That's about the size of it, Kael said. Elodie tapped her fingers on the desk, thinking. And you have documentation proving Crowley's claim was fraudulent? We do, Clara said. Witnesses? Judge Harrow, the sheriff, townspeople who can testify we were building a legitimate homestead. Elodie nodded slowly. It's a strong case, but Crowley's family has money. They'll bring in lawyers who know how to twist facts. You'll need someone who can fight dirty. That's why we're here, Kael said. Elodie studied him. You know I don't work for free. I know, but I don't have money to pay you. Then what do you have? Kael hesitated. Then he said, the land. If we win, I'll deed you 10 acres. Elodie raised an eyebrow. 10 acres of desert scrub? It's good land, Kael said. Water rights, timber access. It's worth something. Elodie considered this. Then she smiled, a sharp, predatory thing. All right, Redstone, you've got yourself a lawyer. The hearing was set for a Thursday morning in the courthouse at Prescott. Clara and Kael arrived early, dressed in the best clothes they could afford. Kael in a borrowed suit jacket, Clara in a simple dress she'd sewn from the last of Tully's fabric. The courtroom was packed. Crowley's family sat in the front row, stone-faced and hostile. Clara recognized Crowley's brother, a heavy-set man with cold eyes, and his sister, a sharp-featured woman in black mourning clothes. Elodie was already there, sorting through papers at the defense table. She looked up as they entered and nodded. Ready? She asked. As we'll ever be, Kael said. The judge entered, a stern man named Whitaker with a gray beard and a reputation for fairness. He called the court to order, and the proceedings began. The prosecution went first. Crowley's lawyer, a slick man named Pemberton, painted Clara and Kael as opportunists and murderers. He claimed they'd married fraudulently to steal land, that they'd lured Crowley to the property and killed him in cold blood, that they'd set the fire themselves to cover their tracks. Clara's hands clenched in her lap as she listened. Every word was a lie, but Pemberton delivered them with such confidence that she could see some of the jury starting to believe him. Then it was Elodie's turn. She stood, calm and collected, and began to dismantle Pemberton's case piece by piece. She presented the notation proving Dorn's claim was invalid. She called Judge Harrow to testify about the marriage, and Harrow, sober, serious, confirmed that it had been conducted legally and without coercion. She called Sheriff Dunn, who testified that the scene of the attack showed clear evidence of arson and assault by Crowley's men. She called Tully, who testified that Kael and Clara had been building a legitimate homestead, working the land, living as husband and wife. And then she called Clara. Clara's legs shook as she walked to the witness stand. Pemberton was already smirking, ready to tear her apart. Elodie's voice was steady. Mrs. Redstone, please tell the court what happened the night of the fire. Clara took a breath and began. She told them about Crowley's pursuit, about the men with torches, about the attack. She told them about defending herself, about fighting for her life. Pemberton cross-examined her, trying to trip her up, to make her sound like a liar. But Clara didn't flinch. She met his eyes and told the truth, plain and simple. When she stepped down, she saw something in the jury's faces. Belief. Maybe even sympathy. Elodie called Kael next. He was blunt, unflinching, and when Pemberton tried to rattle him, Kael's response was ice cold. Crowley came to my land with armed men and tried to burn me out, Kael said. I defended my home and my wife. That's not murder. That's survival. The courtroom was silent. Judge Whitaker called for closing arguments. Pemberton made one last attempt to paint them as criminals, but his words rang hollow now. Elodie stood and addressed the jury with quiet intensity. This case isn't about murder, she said. It's about power. It's about a man who thought he could take whatever he wanted, and two people who refused to let him. Thomas Crowley tried to steal their land. He tried to steal Clara Redstone, and when they fought back, he tried to kill them. They didn't commit a crime. They survived one. She sat down. Judge Whitaker dismissed the jury to deliberate. Clara and Kyle waited in the hallway, too nervous to speak. 2 hours later, the jury returned. Not guilty. Clara felt the words wash over her like a wave, relief so strong it nearly knocked her down. Cale's hand found hers, and she squeezed it tight. Crowley's family stormed out of the courtroom, furious and defeated. Elodie walked over, a satisfied smile on her face. "Congratulations, you're free." "Thank you," Clara said, her voice breaking. Elodie nodded. "I'll draw up the deed for those 10 acres. But take your time. Build your home first." As they left the courthouse, Clara looked up at Kyle. "It's really over." "Yeah," Kale said. "It is." They walked out into the sunlight, hand in hand, and for the first time since the night of the fire, Clara felt like she could breathe. They returned to the homestead the next day to find something unexpected. A group of people were there: Tully, the blacksmith, the boarding house owner, the feed supplier, and a dozen others from Sulphur Flats. They'd brought tools, lumber, and supplies, and they were working on the cabin. Tully saw them and grinned. "Figured you could use a hand." Clara's eyes filled with tears. "You didn't have to do this. We know," Tully said, "but you fought for this land. Seems right we help you keep it." Over the next 3 days, the townspeople worked alongside Kyle and Clara, rebuilding the cabin faster than they ever could have alone. They raised the walls, framed the roof, fitted the door. They brought furniture, a table, chairs, a bed frame. They brought food and coffee and laughter. By the end of the week, the cabin was finished. It wasn't perfect. The walls were rough, the floor uneven, the windows still covered with canvas instead of glass. But it was home. On the last night, after everyone had left, Clara and Kyle stood in front of the cabin, looking at what they'd built together. "We did it," Clara said softly. Kyle nodded. "Yeah, we did." Clara turned to him. "I know this started as an arrangement, a way to survive, but it's not that anymore, not for me." Kyle looked at her, his expression unreadable. Then slowly, he reached out and took her hand. "It's not for me either," he said. Clara felt something break open inside her, something that had been locked away for so long she'd forgotten it was there. She stepped closer, and Kyle pulled her into his arms. They stood like that, holding each other under the stars, two people who'd been broken by the world and were learning, slowly, to be whole. And for the first time in her life, Clara felt like she'd found a place where she belonged. That first night in the rebuilt cabin, Clara couldn't sleep. She lay in the new bed frame, staring at the rough-hewn beams above her, listening to Kyle's breathing from the other side of the room. The cabin smelled like fresh-cut timber and wood smoke, and through the canvas-covered window, she could see stars scattered across the black desert sky. Everything had changed, and yet nothing had. They'd won the land, survived the fire, defeated Crowley, but the work wasn't finished. It would never be finished. That was the truth about building a life in a place like this. You fought for it every single day, and some days you barely held on. Cale stirred in the darkness. "You awake?" "Yeah," Clara said. "Can't sleep either." "No." She heard him stand, heard the soft pad of his footsteps across the uneven floor. He stopped near her bed, a dark silhouette against the faint starlight. "Come outside," he said. "I want to show you something." Clara pulled on her shawl and followed him out into the night. The air was cool and clean, the desert silent except for the distant howl of a coyote. Kyle led her past the cabin, past the garden, to the edge of the property where the land sloped down toward the valley below. He pointed to the horizon. "See that?" Clara looked. At first she saw nothing but darkness. Then slowly she began to make out shapes. Distant mountains, the curve of the land, the faint shimmer of what might be water reflecting starlight. "That's ours," Kyle said quietly. "All of it. As far as you can see." Clara felt something swell in her chest. It wasn't pride, exactly. It was something deeper. Something like belonging. "It's beautiful," she said. "It's hard," Cale corrected, "and it'll try to kill us every chance it gets. But it's ours." Clara looked at him. In the starlight, his face was softer than she'd ever seen it. The hardness was still there. It probably always would be. But underneath it, there was something else. Something like peace. "I used to think surviving meant just staying alive," Clara said. "Making it through one more day. But this feels different." "Yeah," Cale said. It does. They stood in silence for a while, shoulder to shoulder, looking out at the land they'd fought so hard to keep. Then Kael said, "You know you don't have to stay, right? The marriage was for the claim. We've got the land now. If you wanted to leave, I'd understand." Clara turned to him, surprised. "Is that what you want?" "No," Kael said immediately, "but I need to know it's what you want. Not because you're trapped, not because you don't have anywhere else to go, but because you choose to be here." Clara thought about that. She thought about the girl she'd been when she collapsed in the desert, desperate, alone, certain she was going to die. She thought about everything that had happened since. The work, the fear, the fire, the fight. And she thought about Kael, the way he'd pulled her from the dust and given her water, the way he'd stood beside her when Crowley's men came, the way he looked at her now like she was someone worth choosing. "I'm staying," Clara said. "Not because I have to, because I want to." Kael's expression softened, and he reached out and took her hand. His palm was rough with calluses, warm against hers. "Good," he said. They walked back to the cabin together, hand in hand, and when Clara finally fell asleep that night, it was with a sense of certainty she hadn't felt in years. Winter came early that year, sweeping down from the mountains with bitter winds and frost that turned the desert white. Clara and Kael spent the cold months fortifying the cabin, chinking gaps in the walls, building a proper chimney for the stove, laying a wood floor over the packed dirt. They worked together in a rhythm they'd developed over months of labor, anticipating each other's movements, communicating in glances and gestures more than words. The garden had died back with the frost, but they'd harvested enough to fill the root cellar: beans, squash, tomatoes preserved in jars. Kael hunted when the weather allowed, bringing back rabbits and the occasional deer. They rationed carefully, knowing that if the snow got bad, they might be cut off from town for weeks. One evening in late December, as they sat by the fire eating venison stew, Kael said, "We should think about livestock. Chickens, maybe. A cow if we can afford it." Clara looked up from her bowl. "Can we?" "Not yet, but come spring, if we work the land right, we might be able to trade for some." "What would we trade?" Kael gestured to the shelves Clara had stocked with preserves. "Those. People in town will pay good money for food that doesn't come out of a can. And you've got a hand for sewing. We could sell clothes, blankets." Clara considered this. It was a small thing, but it felt significant. Planning for a future beyond just survival. Planning for a life. "All right," she said. "Come spring, we'll do it." Kael smiled, and Clara felt warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. But the snow melted in March, and with it came a visitor. Clara was outside checking the garden for new growth when she saw a woman riding toward the cabin on a gray mare. The woman was young, maybe Clara's age, with red hair tied back and a determined set to her jaw. Clara called for Kael, and he emerged from the cabin wiping his hands on a rag. The woman dismounted and approached them with a cautious smile. "Mr. and Mrs. Redstone?" "That's us," Kael said. "My name is Sarah Brennan. My husband and I have a homestead about 10 miles east. We heard about what happened with Crowley." Clara tensed. "What about it?" Sarah's expression turned sympathetic. "We heard you fought him off. Burned down your cabin and rebuilt it yourselves. People are talking about it, saying you've got grit." Kael frowned. "That all you came to say?" "No," Sarah said. "I came to ask if you'd be willing to help us. There's a group of homesteaders, 5 families, including mine, who've been getting pushed around by a cattle baron named Merrick. He's claiming our land overlaps with his grazing territory. Says if we don't clear out, he'll drive us off." Clara exchanged a glance with Kael. "And you want our help, why?" "Because you beat Crowley," Sarah said simply. "You stood your ground and won. We need someone who knows how to do that." Kael crossed his arms. "We're not looking for another fight." "Neither are we," Sarah said. "But sometimes you don't get a choice." Clara understood that better than most. She looked at Kael, and something passed between them. A shared understanding, a recognition that they'd been where these people were now, desperate, cornered, out of options. "What do you need from us?" Clara asked. Sarah's face brightened. Advice, mostly. Strategy. And maybe, if it comes to it, someone willing to stand with us when Merrick shows up. Kale sighed. All right, we'll come take a look. But no promises. Sarah smiled. That's all I'm asking. They rode out to the Brennan homestead the next day and found a cluster of families trying to carve out a living in land even harsher than theirs. The homesteads were small, barely more than shacks, and the people looked worn down by fear and exhaustion. Sarah introduced them to the others. Tom Brennan, her husband, a quiet man with a limp from an old injury. The Carters, an older couple with 3 young children. The Lewises, newlyweds barely 20. The Harpers, a family of 6 squeezed into a 2-room cabin, and the Doyles, a single father raising 2 teenage boys. They gathered in the Brennans' cabin, and Clara listened as they explained the situation. Merrick had been harassing them for months, cutting their fences, driving cattle through their crops, threatening violence. The local law wouldn't help because Merrick had money and influence. So what do we do? Tom asked, looking at Kyle. Kale leaned against the wall, his arms crossed. First, you document everything. Every time Merrick's men cut a fence or damage your property, you write it down. Date, time, what happened. You need a record. We've tried that, Carter said. Sheriff doesn't care. Then you go over his head, Clara said. You send your records to the territorial governor. Make enough noise, and someone will have to pay attention. And in the meantime, Harper asked, what do we do when Merrick comes back? Kyle's expression was grim. You make it clear you're not leaving. You patrol your land. You repair what gets damaged. And if his men come with guns, you meet them with guns. The room went silent. You're talking about a war, Doyle said quietly. I'm talking about standing your ground, Kyle said. Same as we did. Sarah looked at Clara. How did you know when to fight? Clara thought about that night, the fire, the gunshots, the moment she'd picked up the fallen pistol and made her choice. When running would have killed us anyway, Clara said. When staying was the only option left. Over the next few weeks, Kyle and Clara helped the homesteaders prepare. They showed them how to reinforce their cabins, how to set up watch rotations, how to shoot straight and hold their ground. Clara taught the women how to reload quickly, how to stay calm under pressure. Kyle worked with the men on tactics, on creating defensible positions. It wasn't much, but it was something. And slowly, Clara saw the fear in these people's faces start to harden into resolve. Then, on a warm afternoon in April, Merrick came. He rode in with 20 men, all armed, all looking like they'd done this before. Merrick himself was a big man with a thick beard and eyes like a bull, mean and stupid and used to getting his way. The homesteaders were ready. They stood in a line in front of the Brennan cabin, rifles in hand, with Kyle and Clara at the center. Merrick reined in his horse and looked them over with amusement. Well, he said. Looks like someone's been teaching you to play soldier. This is our land, Tom Brennan said, his voice shaking but firm. You've got no right to it. Merrick laughed. I've got every right. My cattle need grazing land and you're in the way. Then graze them somewhere else, Cale said. Merrick's eyes narrowed. Who the hell are you? Someone who's not interested in your threats, Kyle said. You want this land, you're going to have to take it, and it's going to cost you. Merrick's face darkened. You don't know who you're dealing with. Yeah, I do, Kyle said. A bully with money who thinks he can push people around because no one's ever pushed back. Well, we're pushing back, so either turn around and leave or find out what happens when you don't. For a long moment, Merrick stared at them, his face red with anger. Then he looked at the line of armed homesteaders, at the rifles pointed at his men, at the cold determination in their eyes. He spat into the dirt. This isn't over. Yeah, it is, Clara said. Merrick turned his horse and rode off, his men following. The homesteaders watched them go, not lowering their weapons until the riders were out of sight. Then slowly they began to relax. Someone let out a shaky laugh. Someone else started crying. Tom Brennan turned to Kyle and stuck out his hand. Thank you, he said. Cale shook it. You did the hard part. You stood. They stayed with the homesteaders for another week, helping them repair the damage Merrick's men had done and making sure they were truly safe. Then, as spring turned toward summer, Kyle and Clara rode back to their own land. The cabin looked different somehow, Smaller, maybe. Or maybe they'd just gotten used to it. Clara dismounted and walked to the garden, where green shoots were pushing up through the soil. She knelt and touched the leaves, feeling the life in them. Kale came up beside her. "You did good back there." Clara looked up at him. "So did you." "I mean it," Kale said. "Those people were ready to run. You helped them find something to stand for." Clara stood and brushed the dirt from her hands. "I just told them what you told me, that running doesn't always save you. Sometimes you have to fight." Kale looked at her, and something shifted in his expression, something soft and unguarded. "I love you," he said. Clara's breath caught. It was the first time he'd said it, the first time either of them had. "I love you too," she said. Kale pulled her close, and Clara let herself lean into him, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her cheek. For so long she'd been running, for so long she'd been afraid. But here, in this moment, with this man, she felt safe. She felt home. Summer brought the inspector. He arrived on a Tuesday, a different man than Brennan, younger, sharper, with a clipboard and a professional demeanor. His name was Graves, and he was there to conduct the final review of their homestead claim. Kyle and Clara showed him everything: the cabin, the garden, the root cellar, the fences, the livestock they'd managed to acquire, 3 chickens and a half-wild goat that Clara had named Stubborn because it refused to be penned. Graves took notes, asked questions, examined the land. He checked their marriage certificate, their tax payments, their receipts from town. He was thorough and methodical, and Clara's anxiety grew with every mark he made on his clipboard. Finally, after what felt like hours, Graves set down his pen and looked at them. "Everything appears to be in order," he said. "You've met all the requirements for proving up your claim. Congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. Redstone. This land is officially yours." Clara felt the words wash over her like rain after a drought. Officially theirs. No more disputes. No more threats. No more fear of losing it. Cale shook Graves's hand, his face carefully neutral, but Clara could see the relief in his eyes. After Graves left, they stood together in front of the cabin, looking out at the land that was now, legally and irrevocably, theirs. "We did it," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah," Kyle said, "we did." Clara turned to him. "What do we do now?" Kale smiled a real smile that reached his eyes. "Now we live." And they did. The months that followed were the hardest and the best of Clara's life. They planted more crops: corn, wheat, vegetables that thrived in the difficult soil. They built a chicken coop and a small barn. They cleared more land, extended the fence, dug irrigation channels from the spring. The work was endless, brutal, unforgiving. Clara's hands were never without cuts or blisters. Her back ached constantly. Some mornings she could barely drag herself out of bed. But she also laughed more than she had in her entire life. She laughed when the goat escaped and led Kyle on a chase through the scrub. She laughed when the chickens refused to lay eggs for a week and Kyle threatened to turn them into stew. She laughed when they danced in the cabin on her birthday, clumsy and graceless, to music only they could hear. She learned Kyle's rhythms, his silences, the way his hands moved when he was thinking. She learned that he liked his coffee black and too hot, that he hummed while he worked, that he was afraid of storms but would never admit it. And Kale learned her. He learned that she woke before dawn and liked to watch the sunrise. He learned that she sang when she thought no one was listening. He learned that she had nightmares sometimes, dreams of running and fire and men with torches, and that the only thing that helped was his arms around her. They fought sometimes, about money, about work, about nothing at all. But they always came back to each other, always found their way through. One evening in late autumn, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Kyle said, "You ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't run?" Clara considered this. "I'd probably be dead. Or worse. And if I hadn't found you?" "Same thing." Kale was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I think we saved each other." Clara looked at him. "Yeah, I think we did." Yabbed. Winter came again, and with it, news from town. Tully rode out one December afternoon with a letter for Clara. It was from Elodie Marsh, written in her precise, elegant hand. Clara read it twice, then handed it to Kyle. The letter explained that Crowley's estate had been settled. Most of his assets had gone to pay debts, but there was a small sum, $200, that was being distributed to those he'd wronged. As Clara had been named in the legal proceedings, she was entitled to a share. $200, Kyle said, staring at the letter. That's more money than we've seen in 2 years. Clara felt strange about it. It was Crowley's money, earned through lies and cruelty, but it was also a chance to build something real. What should we do with it? She asked. Cale looked at her. What do you want to do with it? Clara thought about the cabin, about the land, about the life they were building. I want to buy glass for the windows, and seeds for spring, and maybe a cow if there's enough left. Kyle smiled. Sounds good to me. They used the money exactly as Clara had planned. The glass arrived in January, and Kyle spent a week fitting it into the window frames. The first night they had real windows, Clara lit every candle in the cabin just to see the light reflected in the glass. It felt like a miracle. Spring came with green shoots and clear skies and the smell of rain on dry earth. Clara planted the new seeds, working the soil until her hands were black with dirt. Cale built a proper barn, big enough for the cow they'd bought, a gentle brown creature Clara named Maple. And one morning in April, Clara woke up sick. At first, she thought it was something she'd eaten. But when the sickness continued for a week, then 2, she began to suspect something else. She didn't say anything to Cale at first. She wanted to be sure. But when a month had passed and her body started to change in ways she recognized, she knew. She told him one evening as they sat by the fire. I'm pregnant, she said simply. Cale went very still. Then he looked at her, his eyes wide. Are you sure? I'm sure. For a long moment he didn't speak. Then he reached out and took her hand, his grip almost painfully tight. Are you scared? He asked. Terrified, Clara admitted. Me too. They sat in silence, holding hands, the weight of this new reality settling over them. We'll figure it out, Kyle said finally. Same as everything else. Clara nodded. Same as everything else? The pregnancy was hard. Clara was sick constantly in the early months, and the work didn't stop just because she was carrying a child. She pushed through it, stubborn and determined, until Kyle started physically stopping her from lifting heavy things or working too long in the heat. You're going to hurt yourself, he said. I'm fine. You're not fine. You threw up 3 times this morning. I'm still standing, aren't I? Kyle sighed. Clara, please, let me do the heavy work. You do what you can, but don't push it. Clara wanted to argue, but she was too tired, so she let him take over more of the labor, and she focused on the things she could do, sewing, cooking, tending the garden. As the months passed and her belly grew, she found herself thinking about the future in ways she never had before. She thought about what kind of mother she'd be, what kind of life this child would have, whether it would be a boy or a girl, whether it would have Kyle's gray eyes or her dark hair. She thought about the fact that this child would be born free, born on land that belonged to them, born into a home built by their own hands. That thought made everything else bearable. The baby came in November during the first cold snap of winter. Clara went into labor in the early morning, and Kyle rode like hell to fetch the midwife from town. By the time they returned, Clara was in the cabin, gripping the bedpost, her face pale with pain. The midwife, a stern woman named Mrs. Cole, took over immediately, barking orders at Kyle and shooing him out of the cabin. The labor was long and brutal. Clara screamed until her voice gave out, squeezed the midwife's hand until both their knuckles were white. She thought she was going to die. She was certain of it. And then, just when she couldn't take any more, the baby came. A girl, small and red and furious, with a cry that could wake the dead. Mrs. Cole cleaned her and wrapped her in a blanket, then placed her in Clara's arms. Clara looked down at her daughter's face and felt something break open inside her, something vast and overwhelming and more powerful than anything she'd ever known. She's beautiful, Mrs. Cole said. Clara couldn't speak. She just held her daughter close and cried. When Kyle finally came in, his face was pale with worry. But when he saw Clara holding the baby, his expression softened into something Clara had never seen before. Wonder. He walked over slowly, like he was afraid he might break something, and looked down at his daughter. She's perfect, he whispered. She is, Clara said. Cale reached out and touched the baby's tiny hand, and her fingers closed around his thumb. He made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "What should we name her?" Clara asked. Kale thought for a moment. "Hope," he said. We'll call her Hope." Clara looked at her daughter, at Kyle, at the cabin around them, and she thought about everything they'd survived to get here, everything they'd lost and everything they'd built. "Hope," she repeated. "I like that." The first year of Hope's life was chaos. The baby cried constantly, slept in short bursts, and demanded attention every waking moment. Clara was exhausted in ways she hadn't known were possible. Kyle tried to help, but he was clumsy with the baby at first, afraid he'd hurt her. But slowly, they figured it out. Kyle learned to hold Hope without looking terrified. Clara learned to sleep in snatches whenever the baby slept. They took turns walking her when she cried, feeding her, changing her. And as Hope grew, Clara watched her daughter discover the world, watched her eyes track movement, watched her smile at the sound of Kyle's voice, watched her reach for the sunlight streaming through the glass windows. One afternoon in spring, Clara was sitting on the porch with Hope in her lap when Sarah Brennan rode up. "I heard you had a baby," Sarah said, dismounting. "Wanted to come see for myself." Clara smiled. "This is Hope." Sarah leaned down and peered at the baby, who stared back with solemn gray eyes. "She's got your husband's look about her." "Poor thing," Clara joked. Sarah laughed. "How are you managing?" "One day at a time," Clara said honestly. Sarah sat down beside her. "I came to tell you something. The homesteaders wanted me to thank you. Since you and Cale helped us stand up to Merrick, we've started working together, sharing tools, helping with harvests, watching each other's backs. We're building something real out here." Clara felt warmth spread through her chest. "That's good." "It is," Sarah said, "and it wouldn't have happened without you." After Sarah left, Clara sat with Hope and looked out at the land. The garden was green and thriving. The barn stood sturdy against the wind. Smoke rose from the cabin chimney. It wasn't perfect. The work was still hard. Money was still tight. The desert was still unforgiving. But it was theirs, and that made all the difference. Years passed. Hope grew into a wild, fearless child with her father's gray eyes and her mother's stubborn streak. She learned to walk, then run, then climb everything in sight. She chased the chickens, pestered the cow, and followed Kyle around the property like a shadow. Clara and Kyle expanded the homestead. They built a second room onto the cabin. They planted an orchard, apple and peach trees that would take years to bear fruit but represented a future they were finally brave enough to believe in. They made friends with the other homesteaders, helped them when times were hard, accepted help when they needed it. They became part of a community, something neither of them had ever really had before. And through it all, Clara and Kyle grew together. They learned each other's scars, their fears, their dreams. They fought and made up and learned to forgive. They built a life that was messy and imperfect and absolutely theirs. One evening, when Hope was 5, Clara stood in the doorway of the cabin watching her daughter play in the dirt with a stick and a pile of stones. Cale came up beside her, slipping his arm around her waist. "You ever miss it?" he asked. "The way things were before?" Clara thought about the girl she'd been, desperate, alone, running for her life. She thought about the long road that had led her here, to this moment, to this man, to this life. "No," she said, "not even a little bit." Kyle pulled her closer. "Good, because I don't either." They stood together in the doorway, watching their daughter play, watching the sun set over the land they'd fought so hard to keep. And Clara realized something. She'd spent so much of her life running from things. Running from Crowley, from her past, from the person she used to be. But somewhere along the way, she'd stopped running. She'd found a place to stand. A person to stand with. A reason to stay. She'd found home. Not the kind of home that's given to you, easy and soft and safe, but the kind you build with your own hands. The kind you fight for. The kind that costs you everything and gives back even more. The kind that's worth it. The years continued to turn, each one bringing its own struggles and victories. There were droughts that tested them, winters that nearly broke them, losses that made Clara wonder if they'd survive. But they always did. They survived because they'd learned something that most people never figure out, that strength isn't about never falling. It's about getting back up again and again and again. That love isn't about perfection. It's about choosing each other, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. That home isn't a place you find. It's something you create, with work and sacrifice and the stubborn refusal to give up. When Hope was 10, she asked Clara about Crowley. She'd heard stories in town, whispers about the fire and the fight. She wanted to know if they were true. Clara thought about lying, about protecting her daughter from the ugly parts of their history. But in the end, she told the truth. A man tried to take everything from us, Clara said. Our land, our freedom, our lives, and we fought back. Were you scared? Hope asked. Terrified, Clara said honestly. But I did it anyway, because sometimes being scared doesn't matter. Sometimes you have to stand and fight, even when you're shaking so hard you can barely hold your ground. Hope considered this. And it worked? It did, Clara said. But not because we were stronger or braver, because we had something worth fighting for. What? Clara looked at her daughter, at the cabin behind them, at Kael working in the field. Each other. This place. The life we were building. Hope nodded, absorbing this. Then she said, I'm glad you fought. Clara smiled. So am I. When Clara was 40, the government sent another inspector to review the homestead. By then, it was more formality than necessity. The land was clearly established, prosperous even, but the inspector came anyway. He was a young man, fresh from the city, and he looked around the property with obvious surprise. This is impressive, he said. You've done well here. We've worked hard, Kael said. The inspector made his notes, signed his papers, and handed over the final deed, the permanent, uncontestable proof of ownership. That night, Kael and Clara sat on the porch with the deed between them. Hope was asleep inside. The desert was quiet except for the wind and the distant yip of coyotes. We really did it, Clara said, touching the paper. It's really ours. Kael took her hand. It was always ours. This just makes it official. Clara leaned her head on his shoulder. I keep thinking about that first night, when you found me by the well. You were half dead, Kael said. I was all the way dead. I just didn't know it yet. And now? Clara looked out at the land, at the life they'd built. Now I'm more alive than I've ever been. They sat in comfortable silence, two people who'd learned that the best things in life aren't easy. They're earned, built, fought for, and they're worth every scar. Clara lived to see Hope grow into a young woman as fierce and stubborn as her mother. She lived to see the homestead expand, to see neighbors become friends, to see the desert bloom in ways she'd never imagined. She lived to see Kael's hair turn gray, to see the lines deepen around his eyes, to see him slow down but never stop. And when she was old, sitting on the porch of the cabin they'd built together, she thought about the journey that had brought her here. She thought about the scared girl who'd run into the desert, certain she was going to die. She thought about the bargain she'd struck with a stranger, a marriage on paper that became something real. She thought about fire and blood and the moment she'd chosen to fight instead of run. And she thought about what she'd learned along the way, that survival isn't enough. You have to build something worth surviving for. That love isn't about finding someone perfect. It's about finding someone worth fighting beside. That home isn't given. It's made, with hands and hearts and the stubborn refusal to quit. That sometimes the hardest thing and the right thing are the same thing, and that the scars you earn fighting for what matters don't make you weaker. They make you whole. Clara looked out at the land, their land, and smiled. She'd found her place in the world, not by accident, not by luck, but by choosing it, by building it, by refusing to let anyone take it away. And in the end, that was what mattered. Not where you started, but where you chose to stand, and who you chose to stand with.